The Kremlin is preparing a new offensive in Ukraine in the next 2 months. To do this, Putin wants to involve North Korean military forces. Meanwhile, Kyiv is changing its approach to the war. And while Ukraine's Western allies are not being particularly bold in their decisions, Putin is building a strong coalition. Meanwhile, analysts warn that a ceasefire is not expected in the near future, and the question of a possible fall of Ukraine is becoming increasingly real. All this and more in our upcoming broadcast. This is TSN.ua News, and I'm Alina Turashin. Subscribe to our channel, like, and leave your comments. Now let's move on to the main story. The American publication Axios, citing its own sources, reported on the contents of a phone conversation that took place on July 3rd between dictator Putin and U.S. President Donald Trump. According to the publication, Putin clearly outlined his intentions regarding further escalation of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The Russian dictator announced plans to carry out another escalation within the next 2 months, aiming to reach the administrative borders of the Ukrainian regions that Moscow considers its own. A source familiar with the details of the conversation confirmed that the Kremlin leader expressed determination for further escalation of the war. Trump later relayed this information to French President Emmanuel Macron, noting that Putin intends, within the next 60 days, to once again attempt to occupy territories up to the administrative borders of the Ukrainian regions where Russia already has a significant foothold. The American president informed Macron that Putin, and I quote, wants to seize all of it. According to the German publication Bild, the Kremlin is actively preparing for a new offensive against Ukraine, which is expected by the end of the summer. As part of this preparation, Russia is intensifying its air attacks, aiming to disable Ukraine's air defense systems. The publication notes that the attacks are becoming increasingly frequent and severe. Putin is not backing down from his original military objectives, demanding full control over 4 Ukrainian regions as well as Crimea. He continues to dictate the terms for peace, which include excluding Ukraine from NATO and limiting the size of its army. Putin is taking advantage of the waning public interest in the war around the world, which is evident in the 4th year of the conflict, as an opportunity to continue the relentless shelling of Ukrainian cities, which takes place day and night. According to Russian propagandists, the commander-in-chief of the Russian army personally reported to Putin about their readiness for a new phase of the war and presented a detailed offensive plan, which is set to begin in the second half of the summer. It is expected that this offensive will extend not only to the already occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, but will also go beyond their borders. To free up Russian troops from border service, it is planned to transfer their functions to North Korean military personnel. Specifically, this refers to a contingent of 30,000 soldiers, whose training has already been approved by Kim Jong-un's regime. Earlier, the North Korean dictator himself also announced intentions to send additional North Korean military units. Bild emphasizes that the shelling of Ukrainian cities continues almost non-stop. A source from Ukraine commenting on the situation for the publication confirms Putin is not interested in real negotiations. Otherwise, his conditions would be completely different. I would add that Viktor Trihobov, the spokesperson for the Ukrainian armed forces in the Khortytsia region, said on the United News telethon that the Russians are not stopping their attempts to enter the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. The fighting has approached its administrative border. Trihobov reminded that for the past 3 weeks, the Russians have been claiming that they have supposedly entered the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region. However, at present, the enemy is not there. He noted that, in theory, saboteurs could enter the territory of Dnipropetrovsk region, but, as the spokesperson added, in theory they could just as well enter the territory of Volyn region from Belarus. Let us recall that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that since the beginning of 2025, Russia has already lost 100,000 soldiers killed at the front. He clarified that Ukraine's numbers are lower, but still very significant. Meanwhile, The Guardian writes that Kyiv is changing its approach to the war with Russia, preparing for a prolonged defense without a ceasefire. Ukraine must build its defense and diplomatic strategy, taking into account the new reality. Moscow has no intention of stopping the war, because despite political signals from the West and hopes for diplomatic breakthroughs, especially from the Donald Trump administration, there is no sign of either a ceasefire or stabilization of the front on the horizon. Over the past few months, the expectation that the West would be able to persuade Putin to agree to a ceasefire has proven to be mistaken. Instead, Russia is stepping up a new offensive, particularly in the direction of Veliky Burlik, east of Kharkiv, and is also increasing missile and drone strikes on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The publication notes that the need for a new concept of warfare is becoming increasingly obvious. Former Ukrainian Defense Minister Andriy Zahorodny called it strategic neutralization, meaning a prolonged defensive campaign aimed at preventing Russia from advancing deeper into Ukrainian territory and paralyzing the Kremlin's attempts to destabilize key sectors of Ukrainian life. This strategy has already shown results in the case of the Black Sea. Ukraine, which did not have a navy, managed to inflict significant damage on the Russian Black Sea fleet using maritime drones and effectively opened the grain corridor without Russia's consent. This became a symbol of the so-called functional defeat of the enemy, which was mentioned by British politician James Heapy. On land, implementing such a plan involves ramping up the production of FPV drones and extending their range to 40 or even 60 kilometers. This will make it possible to create a militarized zone where Russian troops will not be able to concentrate or operate effectively. Such an approach could become an alternative to the Korean scenario of freezing the conflict, creating a mobile front deep in the enemy's rear. At the same time, Kyiv has no illusions about regaining the occupied territories in the near future. However, according to estimates, in June alone the Russian army was losing up to 1,100 soldiers per day, which indicates the effectiveness of the Ukrainian defense even in a limited resource mode. However, strategic neutralization requires stable support, particularly from the United States. Narrator. Meanwhile, The Guardian columnist Simon Tisdall has published a troubling column about what will happen if Ukraine falls. The author notes that this question is no longer abstract and requires an immediate answer. He pointed out that despite numerous calls for peace, the world has not been able to stop the bloodshed in Ukraine. Despite the enemy's significant advantage in numbers and weaponry, Ukraine continues to put up heroic resistance. This heroism, which has become almost commonplace against the backdrop of the horrors of war, is now taken for granted. However, as Putin intensifies his aggression every night, unleashing record waves of attack drones on Kyiv and other cities, while U.S. support and peace initiatives wane, Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are facing exhaustion. In such a situation, the question of a possible fall of Ukraine is becoming increasingly real and urgent. If Ukraine is defeated, it will be an epic strategic failure for the West, on a scale that could match or even surpass the disasters in Afghanistan and Iraq. The negative consequences for Europe, the United Kingdom, the transatlantic alliance, and international law will be truly horrific. The very thought of such a scenario should draw the utmost attention, the author says. Narrator. Since the end of 2023, when the Ukrainian counteroffensive slowed down, it became clear that Ukraine would not achieve a quick victory. For most of this year, Russian troops have been relentlessly advancing in Donetsk and other eastern directions, despite suffering enormous losses, which are estimated to have recently surpassed 1 million killed and wounded. However, the offensive continues. Although there has been no large-scale breakthrough by Russia, for Ukraine's exhausted and undersupplied defenders, the war has turned into a daily struggle for survival. Narrator. The fact that they are still managing to hold the line at all is impressive, says a Guardian analyst. Serious doubts are emerging about how long Ukraine can hold the front line, not only on the battlefield and in the air, but also on the diplomatic and political fronts. The country is running short on manpower, ammunition, and interceptor missiles. Although Ukraine is still capable of delivering powerful counterstrikes, as evidenced by the incursion into Russia's Kursk region and the destruction of strategic bombers deep behind enemy lines last month, such temporary successes do not alter the fundamental imbalance of forces or the overall trajectory of events. Ukraine is also increasingly lacking reliable friends, although perhaps that has always been the case. Putin has formed his own coalition of the willing, including China, Iran, North Korea, and others, to support his war machine. Meanwhile, the Western equivalent, led by the United Kingdom and France, is in a state of uncertainty. The deployment of support military forces cannot take place. Due to Putin's intransigence and Donald Trump's incompetence, the ceasefire is not being maintained and is not expected in the near future. Narrator. French President Emmanuel Macron and UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer have repeated the familiar promises of unwavering support. However, as a columnist for The Guardian writes, it's easy to make promises, but providing effective military aid is much more difficult. Like other European countries, the UK and France lack advanced weaponry and materials in the necessary quantities, supplies that only the United States can provide. In an attempt to fill this gap, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz proposes buying American Patriot batteries and transferring them to Kyiv. However, just like for the EU as a whole and the participants of last month's NATO summit, Merz's top priority is national self-defense. While considering missiles for Ukraine, he is simultaneously tripling Germany's defense spending. The United Kingdom is doing almost the same thing. Narrator: according to the author, Trump remains Kyiv's biggest diplomatic headache. His one-sided 30-day ceasefire plan was rejected by Moscow, and the trade deals he proposed between the US and Russia were dismissed. After months of smearing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and sucking up to Putin, this very stable genius has concluded that the Russian dictator, accused of war crimes, is talking nonsense and can't be trusted. Trump is now claiming that he will reinstate restrictions on supplying defensive weapons to Kyiv and might even support additional sanctions. But according to The Guardian's columnist, this isn't about policy or principles. The author argues that it's his ego and feelings that have been hurt. Narrator: a single flattering word from his Kremlin brother could instantly change his position. Like all bullies, Trump instinctively sides with the stronger party. It's no surprise that Putin is counting on being able to wear down Ukraine, outlast the West, and win the war. As Simon Tisdall writes, at the moment two outcomes seem most likely: an endless stalemate or the collapse of Ukraine. A defeat for Ukraine and a settlement on Putin's terms would be a defeat for the West, a strategic failure overall that would herald an era of ongoing, broader conflict across Europe. For the Russians, neither of these outcomes will mean a lasting victory either. Greater efforts are needed to convince Russian politicians and the public that this war, which has cost their country so many lives, can be ended through negotiations, that legitimate security concerns will be addressed, and that the alternatives are far worse. But, the author notes, first they must hand over the main architect of this horror. The chief author of Russia's disgrace must be stripped of power, removed, and handed over to international justice. It is Putin, not Ukraine, who must fall. And what do you think? How might events in Ukraine develop further? Write your thoughts to us below this video because it's important to us. Narrator: and I say goodbye for now. See you in the next episodes.